public advocate, please.
Um, we need commitment, and it's hard to get commitment. We've heard words at times, but we never have a full commitment to reimagine this. Even if the governor, well, frankly, between the governor and the mayor, sadly, is actually pushing this even a little bit more. Still seems to be focused on the policing aspect, and the NYPD is now, by I guess having these conversations, I'm not sure what they're going to hear that they've never heard before, and so we kind of have to move past that to reimagine this whole thing. And there are two things here. One is we lost, some of us lost some of the ground when it came to hashtag defund police, which I'm very comfortable with. But if we're honest, we lost some of that narrative because people took it and did not understand what it was. So what I would always tell people, look past the hashtag, defund, reallocate, reimagine, it's all the same thing. And the fact is, if it's $6 billion, $9 billion, what is that money being used for? And where can we shift some of those resources? If police are no longer responding to mental health calls, then why do they need the money to do that? And so those are very real questions that we could have had, but everybody started screaming and we lost some of that narrative. And it's been hard to get the police department ever to acknowledge that there is disparity based on race, period. No matter how many videos we see, I tried to, just recently during Sukkot, I tried to be more constructive, but if we're honest, how they responded to the same behavior in Borough Park was different than how they responded to similar behavior in some of the Black Lives Matter protests, how they worked on social distancing, how they cite and give people citations for riding a bicycle on a sidewalk in Bed-Stuy, East New York versus Park Slope are different. And we have to have honest conversations about that. It's hard to deal with a problem when we won't even acknowledge what it is. And that's the second part. We got to acknowledge the disparity. But the first part really is we have to let folks know this process that we're going through is to keep everyone safe. And that means we have to be focused on where our resources are going. To your question is, it's not a matter about how much money we have. It's about what we do with the money we have. And so one of the problems in this last budget is we said that we have no money to hire anybody. We said we can't hire any additional nurses, any additional guidance counselors, no doctors. They were shutting down places in hospitals, except for police officers. We can spend millions of dollars on police officers. And that's a bad message. That doesn't mean that we don't understand law enforcement has a role, but what we're saying their role is more important than anybody else when it comes to public safety. And that's a danger.
Councilman, you're going to be working on another budget next year. The mid-year budget modifications in less than a month or around a month. Are these issues, is the administration going to be able to raise the same resistance where they say we're constrained for funds so we can't reallocate billions here or there? Or do you think the city council is going to be able to invest in these sort of root causes of public safety, anti-poverty, homelessness, et cetera?
Well, let me start, and I want to circle back to some important things that our public advocate said. And he's absolutely correct. When you look at waste within the department, and there's always money. You know, when people say there's no money, there's always money in the city of New York. It's how do we spend it? How efficient are we and effective in making sure that we're utilizing that money and using it in a laser focused way to address many of the things that bubble to the surface during this pandemic. You know, when you look at healthcare, when you look at housing, when you look at the challenges of unemployment, food insecurity, which, you know, if you go to any food pantry line, you're going to see it's quadrupled at this point, if not more in some places. So there's always money. Just look at how much money the police department spent in overtime last year. I mean, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, no checks and balances. Over $700–800 million. If there was checks and balances there, some of that money, as I said during the budget vote, could have been reinvested right back into communities. You look at police misconduct suits. I mean, the city is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on police misconduct because the police department has not been good at policing themselves. That's money that can easily, if there's accountability, if people are held accountable, if we work on getting rid of those who actually don't adhere to the oath that they took when they took the oath to become an NYPD, if we got rid of those folks, you're saving hundreds of millions of dollars. The problem is we have a department that has been stagnant in many of these areas, and it's been a heck of a lot of resistance going back. I mean, from the inception of me being chair, but even prior to that, on many of these issues. So absolutely, we should look at school safety. You know, the school safety need to stay in the police department. I mean, I remember, and I'll just give a quick story. You know, I was a student at Jamaica High School. God forbid you got to school and went through scanning and you went red. You know, they were in there checking under my tongue to make sure I didn't have a razor blade. You know, I mean, those are the experiences of young Black and brown New Yorkers that actually criminalizes them from the inception, from the womb to the tomb, you know, just criminalized for your entire life. You should never get used to having under your tongue checked because you're going into a school building. But what that does point to is the need to make sure that there's a lot of things to do outside of these school buildings, a lot of things to do in these communities to address a lot of the disparities that we're talking about here today. So absolutely, if you talked about mental health, there are plenty of community-based organizations out here doing this work. And I know I got to shut up in a minute, but I want to give credit to also our public advocate, Jumaane Williams, who had a vision in creating the crisis management system. I mean, These are people we're hiring from our communities. I have Rock Safe Streets in Far Rockaway, individuals from our communities who are out there working on those who are suffering from trauma every day in their lives, taking guns out of people's hands. And they're doing this work and not getting the recognition. But these are the sort of programs the city should be investing in. And absolutely, it's a shared responsibility. When you have investment in communities, when you have a police department that truly is accountable to the public, you end up with safer streets.
If we can pivot a little bit, safer streets brings me to my next question. Vision Zero, you know, public safety is just as much as about you being able to bike down the street and, you know, not having to worry about getting run over by a box truck or getting hit by a cab in the bike lane. What role do you think the city has shown enough of a commitment to vision? I mean, I know it's Vision Zero is the mayor's program, but has the city shown enough commitment to keeping cyclists safe on the streets, pedestrians? Has the infrastructure been able to keep up with the need for, especially now during the pandemic, as many people are moving to biking and alternate forms of transit? Renee, I want to ask you here, because this is your forte. What do you think the city could be doing? And also, as you said, reducing interactions with police, focusing more on traffic safety.
Sure. Well, I would certainly defer to either Councilmember Richards or Public Advocate Williams in terms of the weightier policy decisions. But I would say for me personally, you know, enforcement is a small piece of safer streets. Ideally, what you want to do is actually use the data of where violations are occurring to make engineering decisions. Infrastructure, I know it was mentioned earlier, underinvestment in communities of poverty in terms of how, you know, what do the streets look like? Do you have 6 or 8 lanes of fast moving traffic so that it's dangerous for residents to be able to cross the street to, you know, get on the bus to go to the grocery? But enforcement is a piece of it. While unfortunately the work of government is incremental, it takes time. And so while we are investing in what better and safer streets look like, actually enforcing the laws on the books and doing it in a way where a camera is taking a picture of a license plate and not using facial recognition technology or other, you know, human discretion to actually issue a ticket to a violator is something that can reduce bias and increase safety on streets.
You say it can reduce bias, but are there any pitfalls of, you know, the sort of disproportionate impact on low-income communities?
I would say in general, frankly, most fines and taxes end up being regressive and having a more harmful impact on communities with lower incomes and less ability to pay fines. you know, for us as a vendor, we don't have control over what those programs are, but we do have examples where someone like a Los Angeles DOT might ask us to help them in an amnesty program to, you know, reduce the impact of late fees on low-income residents. So that's something where our technology can support them in their goal, whether it's providing them with information or just adapting our software so that they can hit policy objectives that reduce those burdens.
Something worth keeping in mind for the policymakers here, I guess. I want to talk more broadly about technology, technological solutions. I know Councilman Richards, you have concerns about how the city deploys its DNA and gang database, the dragnet nature of how they collect information about people. Tom, you run a tech company focused on this. I guess my question being, is it the tech or is it how it's used? And can the city use tech in a disparate way while focusing more on community-based solutions? It's the people on the ground leading solutions rather than, you know, making these unemotional decisions that end up hurting people. It's more of an open-ended question.
Absolutely.
We're trying to read in this way.
Yeah, I mean, we think about technology, and I could think in my tenure as chairman of the NYPD getting it technically right only once, and that was around their drone policies, where they did reach out to the council and reach out to different stakeholders in advance of rolling out that specific policy, and it's still not perfect. Let's be clear. But when you look at historically how the NYPD uses technology and databases, I mean, for those who don't know, today we're introducing two bills. I'm introduced a bill with my colleague Diana Ayala out of Harlem, because 12-year-olds without their parents' consent were being entered into, their DNA was being stolen. They would be questioned at a police precinct, and they would be offered a cigarette or a can of soda in most cases. And the NYPD, upon exit, would take their DNA, swab their DNA off these soda cans. So they haven't shown that they're trustworthy and accountable and transparent in the way they're using these systems, largely that disproportionately impact Black and brown New Yorkers and criminalize us from the inception once again. Another bill I introduced today, which speaks to this, would require DOI now to create an office of analytical bias. And one of the things and one of the reasons we did this is because data is critical, and technology can be effective if used efficiently and effectively, but it has to be used in a transparent way, where the public knows what you're doing with this data, and it has to be checks and balances. And I can't say in many of these cases that we're seeing the NYPD incorporate these sort of policies before they put people into databases, and it's quite frankly, it's shameful.
Right, Tom. I want to turn to you here. You're co-founder of Taser. It's supposed to be a non-lethal tool, but tasers can kill if they're used improperly, and we've seen that happen. You've created a new tech which is supposed to restrain people without causing any pain, which I believe is supposed to be, it's a solution for when people are in extreme mental health crises. So how do you think that we can keep people safe in these interactions if the police themselves can't be trusted at times in how they employ them?
Well, and again, I think it's a great question, because how technology advancement is great, but how is it used? What's the involvement, to the council member's point, the transparency of not only the data, but also the transparency of the policies, the procedures, the processes. We need to have these challenging conversations so that people understand that. And I think Public Advocate Williams mentioned earlier, if you dial 911, I bet the majority of people think you're either going to get police or fire, and is that the appropriate response? And I can speak personally. My mom has Alzheimer's, and I watched her attack my dad in our house, and we called 911 and the police came. And is that the last thing we wanted to see was the police hurt my mom? So is it critical intervention teams? And that comes back to training and where is the appropriate response? It doesn't, if you call 911, maybe police are not always the appropriate response to send there. And at RAP, we're working on the training enhancement because everybody's filming everything these days too. So it's about escalation. So like even in just the formation of our device, it does not look like a firearm. It's more like a TV remote. So it's a different color. It's not up in an aggressive stance pointing it at somebody, so that it's about de-escalation. It's about training. It's about the involvement, so that as these communities get more involved in these discussions, we have to change the old way of thinking and reinvent not just the technology, but the conversations going on between the leaders and how these technologies are going to be used and implemented throughout the cities. And that's really why we're trying to lead that way forward. We've all seen, I mentioned it earlier, Hollywood shows the way, and our bowler wrap has been compared to the Spider-Man's, threat, or Batman, the string throwing around somebody. So we're trying to bring technologies forward that can reduce the violence, reduce the escalation, and again, change those approaches to the modern policing. And again, as is being discussed here, the use of technology has to be managed in a way that people understand it, so that it is used appropriately, and so that as we continue to learn and evolve, that we can make sure that there's not misuse of the technology or tools. And you mentioned earlier that there can be a bad outcome, and we're doing everything we can to mitigate those bad outcomes, because anything can be misused. So the policy and the training around how they're used hopefully limits or tries to prevent that. And that's where more accountability comes into place with video, body cams, street cams, and the things that Craig mentioned earlier as well, knowing your rights on those interactions. So I think all of that comes together for the implementation of technology, and RAP is trying to we are one of the leaders in this space to try and make that difference.
Craig, I want to turn to you. I want to talk more about the response to mental health crises. The city has tried very hard to address, through Thrive NYC, the big mental health issues among New Yorkers. A lot of people who end up in Rikers are suffering from mental health issues. The public advocate, I hope he hasn't left us, public advocate has talked about there should be another number for mental health, not 911, but a different helpline. What do you think the city needs to do to invest in mental health, which is an issue of like personal safety and public safety? Doing more, where is it falling behind?
Thank you, Samar. So I will go back and reinforce what Councilmember Richards has been saying. And I think that the New York City foster care system is a perfect example of the need to shift resources to a preventive mode. Mm-hmm. So 20 years ago, there were nearly 50,000 children in foster care. Today, there are less than 8,000 here in New York City. And that is due to a purposeful shift in resources away from foster care and focused on an investment in front-end preventive services that are much more supportive of families. And so today we see that 70 to 90% of incarcerated girls report sexual, physical, and severe emotional abuse in childhood. So we need to continue to focus on mitigating traumas. A lot of the traumas that come from the communities that are disadvantaged, under-resourced, are related to the issues related to the social determinants of health, which are about income and social status, social support networks, proper education and employment, health, equal access to quality health services, the safety of the social and physical environment, and healthy child development. In the absence of an investment in the social determinants of health, we have tremendous negative outcomes for children and those children grow up to be adults who also experience tremendous negative outcomes. So we have to invest in our children, and we have to invest in the things that will allow them to grow up with less trauma and in healthy environments. Today, there is a dearth of quality trauma-informed mental health services in the communities that we work in. We started to address that recently over the last couple of years by creating a mental health clinic in the Parkchester Soundview section of the Bronx for children and families. And it's a huge lift to bring those services to fruition. There's no startup funds. A lot of mental health clinics actually start up and then quickly close down after losing millions of dollars because there's no startup funding. And there's no direct correlation or no assistance in directing the need to the resources. Tremendous amount of outreach and human resource legwork has to be done to bring the resources to the people who need it. And often that's not timely enough. And so clinics close. And the other thing is many of the clinics that are out there, they function under such slim margins. The rate of reimbursement is so tight, so slim, that they can't invest in training their people properly in trauma-informed interventions like trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy. So I think the combined investment in front-end preventive services that are directed toward the social determinants of health will eventually lead to less need for police involvement, less need for incarceration, and healthier people.
Right. This brings up the question of public health. We're living through a pandemic, a global pandemic. Public safety right now is as much about being safe, about feeling safe about going back to work, back to school. We've seen the pandemic hit worst in communities of low-income communities of color, where public health outcomes have always been, underinvested in. What do you think the city could be doing more? And, is this an issue that they should have seen long coming? Public advocate, council member, if you'd like to weigh in.
Yeah, there's actually a few things. One, I did want to go back even to something that the council member had mentioned, which is overtime, and the amount of overtime that the police department gets. And I want to put it in some context because we did a great job on Labor Day weekend, community police. I think that was just awesome. I wish they had employed that with what was going on in Borough Park when Sukuk was coming, which it didn't. But what we saw, there was a massive overtime for police, and there was still a mass shooting right around the corner from where a police officer was. What we also saw was some of the community groups, and I appreciate the kudos that we found out there. And we saw a tremendous amount of progress in getting people to comply. And actually, there wasn't as much shooting as everybody thought. People were taking bets, disgusting about how many shootings would happen, and we suppressed it. There was one space between 3 and 6 where there were no community groups because they had no additional money. There was no additional funding given to those organizations that have been doing this work. And if we see the value of overtime in law enforcement, why do we not see the value of providing resources for community groups who can do some of those things and even do them a little bit better? And so that one time period where we were not out there, we had no groups, there was a shooting. I can't say it's one for one, but I can say it is how we can see exactly how we're looking at this. When it comes to technology, I'm not opposed to technology. I always want to get better. I am concerned about we are not able to hold the police accountable for the technology they already have, including transparency. And so I'm concerned about new technology when we can't even get them to grapple with the technology that they have. So that's a conversation that we at least have to have concurrently. When it comes to the pandemic, I've said this and I'm not shy about it. We have the wrong president, the wrong governor, and the wrong mayor for the times and the concurrent crises that we've been working on. And we've seen a failure on every single level. I know the governor has a new book coming out. I don't know what leadership he's going to show in that book because we have tens of thousands of New Yorkers who have died. Now, to the credit of him and others, we began going into a better space, but there were lessons that we didn't have to learn because other places around the globe had learned them. And what we saw were people who moved too slowly, people who didn't have a bold vision and refused to adapt to information as it came. We saw that on the city, state, and of course the federal level. Didn't expect much from the person in the White House because that's what that is. Locally, we should have seen more. We absolutely should have seen these things coming. And we found NYCHA maybe 6 weeks into the pandemic. If the way we look at public safety, the way we're discussing it now, we had looked at it before, I don't think we would have seen as much problems as we saw when the pandemic hit. And again, we saw everything going up: homelessness, food insecurity, lack of access to healthcare. We should have known that in the summer months, gun violence might have also gone up with this pandemic. And it seemed like people were caught off guard by that, even though many of us were screaming for months that we have to prepare. And we've seen such a dearth of leadership on so many levels. And I do give the governor some credit. At least he was a voice when people needed a voice. But he asked for and received unprecedented amount of executive decision-making powers. And for a long time, we didn't see what we needed to see. And the mayor, I mean, I think everybody's in agreement whether they say it or not. But that machismo between the two of them are making things even that much more worse.
Right.
And I'll hop in there. You know, part of the problem we had, and we had a twofold problem. One, there was never a comprehensive plan put in place prior to the pandemic even being hitting New York City and hitting many of these communities. There should have already been some levels of coordination between city agencies and a lot of these community-based organizations who do great work day in and day out, who don't get the funding, as our public advocate said, that they need to really carry out more of a strategy, more of an outreach efforts that they can certainly do. But think about this. You also had a lack of agency coordination. I mean, each agency didn't know what the other was doing. So you had a two-pronged problem during this pandemic. And unfortunately, when there's an old saying, when the elephants fight, the ants get trampled on. So the miscommunication out there, even early on, you know, in my community, Far Rockaway, which was hit hard, you know, we didn't even have a testing site. I mean, so we were so behind the 8 ball, people were walking around asymptomatic, they might not have shown symptoms, and that caused a lot of harm to the point we had refrigerators right outside of our hospitals. But just getting back to the question you asked, the answer is, you know, the outer boroughs are becoming cities amongst themselves. Let's remember, a lot of growth is happening in the outer boroughs. There's an affordable housing squeeze. So people are relocating to communities like Far Rockaway where there is more affordability. But even with the affordability, there historically have not been a lot of job opportunities out there. I mean, we rezoned, thank God. There's development going on now. We'll be able to put people to work eventually with commercial development happening because the market was really stagnant there for a long time. And then you talk about healthcare. You know, we have one hospital on the peninsula. The hospital, I think I was looking at data yesterday, was built to service 10,000 people on the peninsula, yet it's servicing nearly 50,000. So the investments in healthcare have not historically been there as well and have not kept up with the pace of growth in a lot of these communities. There's been a lot of disinvestment. So the answer is we need to make sure that we're addressing a lot of these issues that the pandemic, you know, ripped the sheet off of to really get to the crux of how we create safer communities, but also how we address the health crises that we find ourselves in. Access to food, fresh food and fruits as well. Supermarkets. You know, these are things that a lot of these communities don't have access to. And the government needs to really come up with a plan along with community-based organizations and the private sector to ensure that there's a strategic vision moving forward.
Now we have about 9 minutes left on this, and I just want to let people know, I should have mentioned this before, I think the public advocate has to leave at 3:40, so he won't be here for the Q&A, which is 10 minutes of Q&A afterwards. But I just want to give everyone now, is it about 8 minutes left, an opportunity to talk about things that maybe we haven't mentioned, you know, non-policing related public safety that we haven't talked about today, that you think that our audience should be aware of. Why don't we go sort of one by one? I'll start with Renee.
Sure, thank you. I'd actually like to echo some of what Craig was saying earlier. So in addition to the role I have now, I actually came to Conduent from United Healthcare, where my job was to provide transportation access for folks who had both behavioral health conditions and were living in homelessness. And so the idea of the many wraparound services that are needed in order to allow people to have a stable enough life to try to manage their health and, you know, live a normal and stable life and avoid, you know, some of the over-policing and crimes that happen is something that's really important. I know food insecurity has come up several times, and I think one of the, frankly, few really interesting transformations that the federal government or the state government has done in this COVID-19 pandemic actually started last year when New York State became the first state to start working with the SNAP EBT food benefit to allow people to use their food benefit to get their groceries home delivered or have curbside pickup. And that, I think, has really transformed the experience for folks who are high risk, who don't feel comfortable going out in the middle of a pandemic and are still able to use their entitlement benefits to have access to fresh and healthy food. That's something that actually Conduent partnered with New York State on, and that I think has been a bright spot, frankly, in the federal response to actually leveraging technology in a way that is really helping individuals to access food.
Right. Tom, and if you could hurry, I'll give you a minute because we're about to run out of time.
Certainly.
Tom, anything you talked about?
Certainly. So if I go back to Mr. Williams' comment about transparency, couldn't agree more. And the bowler wrap is in the field. It's being used by police. We've had dozens of uses, and probably nobody has seen it because it ended that confrontation early. And in fact, if you look at two specific instances, one in Georgia, the police were actually talking with the people that called 911 for help. Their nephew was picking up a stick trying to beat them. And they talked about, we've got a non-lethal tool. It's going to change it. The police, it changed their behavior and it had a plan. And we had another instance in Florida where it was used where a mom called the police because her son wanted the police to shoot and kill him. It's called suicide by cop. And you didn't read about that or see it in the media because it's being used now and it's ending it. So it's already changing those behaviors. And that's really the ideal scenario. So again, back to transparency, it's caught on body cam footage, and this is saving lives. And that's where we've got to keep driving with technology so that you don't have all these tragic incidents that become, you know, videos that are seen around the world. But it's like they don't report the planes that land safely every day. We want to have those incidents de-escalate, not have to use force, and not injure people.
Craig?
So I guess I would go back to what I heard in a question in the prior panel, and that is, what would you change about your risk strategy as a result of this pandemic? And I would say my organization put a successful formula in place, and instead of what we would normally do after a crisis has abated is that we would go back to life as normal. And today I would say I would not dismantle what we have put in place because it worked. And what we found in this pandemic is that community-based organizations that are on the front line have to be resourced because we got virtually not a single PPE from our government contractors. We had to go out and get it ourselves. We had to source it ourselves, and we can't dismantle that. So we have to be resourced as frontline essential workforces for the government and be treated and resourced accordingly.
Councilman? And then
I'd say a few quickly. There are three things to keep your eyes on. Civilian Complaint Review Board. You know, I don't think the public is recognizing that their budget has largely been. Well, the mayor has requested that they cut their budget this year, and in the midst of the protests, in the midst of the need for more accountability, we should keep our eye and continue to push to make sure that they're getting the adequate funding. And we talked about technology and body cameras, right? And at the height of even the protests, the CCRB was having challenges of gaining access to body camera footage, which was supposed to be a technology utilized to ensure that there was more transparency in the eyes of the public, but also helpful to police officers as well, who who may be falsely accused, as the police department says. The other thing I would say just briefly is there is a bill in Albany, I believe carried by Assemblymember Catalina Cruz, and I believe it's State Senator Kevin Parker, on a residency requirement for police officers. And I think that that's something that we need to look at and study closely. And I think in the near future, you may see some movement on this, a bill like this, as we talk about reimagining policing here. Thank you.
Mr. Public Advocate, I'll give you the last word that you can leave. You have 2 minutes, I think.
I appreciate that very much. And, to Tom, the technology, I'm always interested in learning any tool. I just want to be clear that we are trying to focus on not having police be the ones that respond. So I don't want to lose that conversation to what Craig was saying. Community groups fill the gap in a way that it would have been horrifying. As horrifying as it was, what would have happened if those community groups weren't there? So we definitely have to get them funded. Two areas that when we talk about defund or reallocate, mental health and traffic, it's two perfect ones. Why are police responding to mental health calls, particularly as a first response? And even not even just with technology, why do police officers have to be the ones to fill out an accident report at an accident scene? And so these are areas that we can look at right now to reallocate resources that can go to people and places and agencies that can do a better job. And a job that doesn't require a gun and a baton and handcuffs. But what I would say is I want people to do this, is to just think about what people feel like when they're safe. And the communities that have access to quality safe housing, have access to quality healthcare and mental health services, have access to healthy food that they can afford nearby them, that have access to educational systems and jobs that can help pay for these things. Public safety looks a lot different. And the communities that don't have access to them, what we tend to do is if we send anything, we send police to try to solve all of those problems. And that is a problematic approach. And that is the approach that we have to reimagine. And so what I'm imploring folks is to understand that, take the time out to unpack when they see a hashtag defund police, or they see people talking about the discussion. It's not about opposition necessarily. It's about law enforcement's role as a partnership to these other things that are not being fully funded. As a matter of fact, in the last budget, the other agencies were defunded way more than the NYPD was. So it's a very strange thing that people are kind of misusing this, but it's really important. Right. I invite everyone to go to advocate.nyc.gov and look at our justice platform and as we reimagine public safety. So I just want to push that. We can't focus on policing and reimagining policing. We have some reforms to the left, but the real discussion is about reimagining public safety and law enforcement's role in it. Thank you so much.
And thank you. I think that's our time. We have 10 minutes for Q&A. If you have to go, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining us, Public Advocate.
Sorry about that.
We don't have very many questions, surprisingly. And they all be focused on I think these are for Councilman and for Tom. If the focus needs to be outside of policing, but police obviously need tools, better tools to safely deal with mental health calls that present a danger to society. I guess the question for you, Tom, is do you think Ebola Rap can do that? Question for you, Councilman Richards, is, and someone's posed the same thing, if someone is experiencing mental health crisis and their family member is threatening to attack a family member with a knife, who do they call? So Tom, why don't you take that first? I think you've answered this before, but I'll give you another, so that they can have their question answered.
Yeah, and somebody in mental crisis, they're not acting logically, and I'm sure, as everybody can acknowledge, I've seen it firsthand. If it goes to the point where they're going to self-harm or hurt somebody else, the issue is to try and get them, into custody so we can get them help quickly. And you don't want to hurt them to do that. But again, because they're in this mental health crisis, they're probably not listening or reacting to logic. So we absolutely believe we're not the perfect solution. The magic bullet doesn't exist. I'm not here to tell everybody that this is the magic bullet. But what we are doing is being a leading company. We're a public company, and we're investing in trying to help solve these issues, because there's not just one answer. And as has been discussed here today, you have to get community involvement. we can't do things the way they've been done in the past. Things change, technology changes, and you have to be engaged from all aspects of the community. And I think we've heard that here repeatedly. And again, we're leading the way through training, through policy, participating in discussions like this. And again, we do absolutely believe it's going to make a difference. We're seeing that. We've seen it save lives, because ultimately that's the goal, is to reduce the conflict in all of these interactions so that everybody does feel safe. That's ultimately what I think everybody's doing. And it's not just the policing, as the public advocate mentioned, it's public safety. And I think that's where, we play a role, elected officials play a role, and all of the groups here in the community play a role to get us back to that point where everyone feels safe.
Councilman?
What
does a person do in that situation? Who do they call?
And I I don't know if many people remember Saeed Vassell out of Brooklyn, and this was someone who was in crises. The neighborhood knew who he was, and unfortunately, he ended up running up and down the block with a sharp object. And the SRG unit out of NYPD was called. Someone called 911. The SRG unit comes, they gun him down. He's dead. And to the community, for those of you who remember the story, he was harmless. Everybody knew who he was. Now, part of the challenge was, when I spoke to his father, and many of you might have remembered the news story, he was not taking his medication. He was not getting the services that he needed to prevent him from running up the block during that incident with a sharp object. So preventative work, and I think one of the panelists drilled down on this, has to be done. There has to be community-based organizations in these communities. And when you look at where services are, you're going to see a direct correlation between these incidents and where there is a lack of services. So you have to start there. The second thing, and I remember after that incident, speaking with Commissioner O'Neill, and we had a more robust conversation around how could we reimagine how the police responds to people in crises. And one of the things the NYPD rightfully came up with was co-response teams, where you have mental health professionals. And I think Staten Island was the first borough where it's piloted at. But I would love to see a program like that rolled out across all 5 boroughs. The NYPD should have dedicated mental health professionals that are part of sectors addressing these calls as they come in through the 911 system, and then they can make that determination. If a cop needs to respond, the cop is at the scene. But under no condition should the police department be the first responder in a lot of these incidents where people are having a crisis.
And we have another. If anyone else would like to weigh in, please do. We have another question here. Unfortunately, some of these questions that have been raised during this panel has been now asked, could have been addressed by the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. It's unfortunate we couldn't have Ms. Glazer here, but what their office does is works on enforcement, community-based alternatives to public safety. So that's I think one of the key perspectives we're missing here. The second and only question we have now is, how do you bring the community to look at this problem to create safety when they look at government to take care of it? So what else can we do to get the community involved in public safety rather than police?
I guess that's for me.
It's for everyone.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah.
I think the answer lies in the community and the police department. And I just want to point back out something that the public advocate pointed out. The community is not anti-police. The anti-police brutality. It doesn't mean programs like the neighborhood coordination officer program is not a good thing. There was a lot of buy-in from our communities when that program was certainly rolled out. And I saw a lot them getting into the trenches of places that they normally wouldn't have had meetings in, public housing developments, places where there was historically a lot of violence. And last year, I can say, or the year before that, in the neighborhood I grew up in, we had a nearly 70 or 80% drop in murders and shootings, partly because of the relationship, not just with the police department, the trust we were built, but also the work that the community-based organizations were doing, the crisis management system, which gets overlooked. Quick story. We were having shootouts in South Queens last summer, and it was these 2 gangs that were going back and forth. and the police department couldn't resolve the issue. I mean, back and forth, back and forth. We end up in a backyard. I go in the backyard with the crisis management system, 11:30 at night, and they meet with these young men and get a truce on some of the shootings that were happening. So making sure you have validators on the ground and funding for organizations like this is key in the strategy. And then you add a sprinkling of police and building trust and accountability, and you're gonna have safe communities. That's the overall solution.
I should point out, I think that the mayor's talked about neighborhood policing yet working, but we haven't seen empirical evidence of it. And one study that's being done by the RAND Corporation isn't going to be out until late next year, maybe even after the mayor's out of office.
They keep
So
pushing
we're
it back,
waiting.
and I agree with you on that.
Yes.
So Mark, if I can comment, you know,
Yeah,
I
Tom, go ahead.
earlier that, you know, unfortunately, when things happen like this, amnesia clicks in really quickly and they forget about it. And I think it's all of our responsibility to make sure we keep these issues on the front burner so that they don't get pushed aside, because they're super important. As an example, we sponsored what was called Faith in Blue this past weekend. You were asking, how do we get more community involvement? So we were asking communities of faith, every religion, to get together, grab local law enforcement, and let's do conversations and start having these conversations. You know, there's a Reverend Markle, who we were working with on that initiative, made the statement that we've done the protesting, we've done the marching, now we got to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And the way to do that is to reach out from both sides, from the community, from the public safety advocates, and get these conversations going, because they're not going to get solved at a federal level. They're even, you know, great that Governor Cuomo's asked for reimagining policing, but this is going to be resolved within those communities. So let's get that engagement going at the community levels. And I think that's, you know, initiatives, they have to happen, and we have to keep pushing this forward and keep it on the front burner.
We have one last question that's come in. Councilman, do you think with proper training and tools, cops can respond better themselves without needing to roll out entire mental health response? I should add some context here. The NYPD CIT training, which is crisis intervention training, which was supposed to do this exact thing. Do you think cops are better if they're better trained?
We've been training for decades, and training is good. I don't want to discourage training. I think it helps them to adapt to the surroundings a lot better. But I'm just going to circle back and say it's key that you really have mental health professionals at the forefront of a lot of these incidents and conversations, because they're the ones on the front lines. I mean, police officers are here they should be focusing on resolving violent crime.
Right.
But, you know, to ask them to do everything in every facet of our life is not the answer to resolving the issue. You need follow-up. Even after someone is brought into custody, there's no follow-up. There's no one checking on them. There's no CBO attached to it. So we need to make sure that CBOs are front and center in this conversation.
And I think that's all our time. John, do you want to take it away? I want to thank everyone for being here.
You.
Thanks. I think we had a good conversation, good debate, a lot of things to think about. Over to you, John.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the whole panel. Great discussion. A couple final notes before we close. We have a few events coming up. I'd like to flag our Manhattan event is next week on Wednesday, October 21st at 5 p.m. We'll be featuring our heroes and speaking with elected officials, leading borough leaders. Registration is on our website for free. We'll link that in the chat. Paymerang has a webinar on nonprofit efficiency and electronic payments on Thursday, October 29th at 2 p.m. And we also have our virtual government procurement conference coming up on Tuesday, November 17th at 1 p.m. You can register for those for free with links on our website and posted in the chat. Thanks to everyone, our sponsors, our speakers, and attendees. And that concludes our program.
Thanks, John.
Thank you all.